Jack the Ripper really is the greatest of unsolved crimes, with new suspects, no matter how tenuous the link, still being put forward to this day. It's not a story I will ever cover, and there's plenty of excellent Ripper podcasts, but sometimes the Victorian criminals I cover inevitably are linked to Britain's most infamous criminal. And that is the case of today's story. This is a story of Frederick Bailey Deeming, a conman, a brutal murderer, and a man of many aliases. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. One of the blessings of being on social media is that I come into contact with many criminologists and historians, and when one of these have a blog, I tend to have a wee peek into their stories. And this was the case from today's episode, which comes straight from the blog of the talented writer Andrew Jago. And he's given me permission to tell this story, and if you enjoy it, you will enjoy Andrew's blog. Details in today's show notes. He is also planning on a future podcast featuring crimes in and around his home city of Plymouth, that last stop of the 1620 Pilgrim Fathers heading to the New World. The arrival of a wooden box at Friary Goods Yard, Plymouth, on the 17th of August, 1891, may not have been a particularly noteworthy occasion in the annals of this fine city's history. However, when many months later that box was opened and the contents examined, it provided not only a link to one of the most brutal murders this country has ever seen, but also the possible identity of the mastermind behind a little-known but large-scale fraud that had rocked the city 3 years previously. The box, made of white deal, had arrived as part of a consignment, included items of children's furniture, and had been sent from St Helens, Lancashire, by Mr A. Wilson of Ashton Road, Prescott, to wait collection by the addressee, Mrs A. Holtz, care of Goods Station, Plymouth. When the box and other items remained unclaimed after a few weeks, an official of the London and South West Railways wrote to the sender in Prescott to update him of the situation. Soon afterwards, the official's letter was returned to Friary by Royal Mail's dead letter office. The sender's address did not exist. Although there's no evidence of an appeal for the owner to come forward, presumably there must have been some local inquiries. Either way, no one came forward to claim the box, and little else could be done to trace either the sender or reciprocant, and the apparently unwanted items lay forgotten at Friary Station. Then, in March 1892, the seemingly unrelated news of a ghastly murder thousands of miles away in Melbourne, Australia, began to reach the shores. Australian police had been called to a house in Andrew Street in the Windsor district of the city. There, prospective tenants had noticed a foul odour coming from one of the rooms. Following an extensive police search of the property, the decomposing remains of a dead woman were found buried under the hearthstone. Injuries on the victim's head and body made it clear she had been subjected to a considerable amount of physical violence, and a subsequent post-mortem found that her throat had been cut. It was estimated she'd been dead for around 3 months. A major murder inquiry was launched, and the police quickly established that the house had been leased to a Mr Druin in December 1891, and he'd paid 3 months' rent up front. a local ironmonger whom Mr. Druin had purchased several items, including cement, a spade, and a broom, gave the police a detailed description. This was a loud and flamboyantly dressed man in his mid-30s, English, with a Lancashire accent, a distinctive beard and moustache. Unfortunately, a search of the local area turned up nothing. Druin had disappeared. Meanwhile, the discovery of a torn luggage ticket in the house in the name of Albert Williams enabled police to identify the victim as Mrs. Emily Williams, and further that she'd arrived in Melbourne with her husband, Albert Oliver Williams. They came aboard the Norddeutscher Lloyd liner Kaiser Wilhelm II on the 9th of December 1891. With no sign of Mr. Williams anywhere, police interviewed passengers from the voyage. With corroborated descriptions of both men, it became clear that Mr. Druin and Albert Williams were in fact one and the same. The extravagant dress and jewellery, the loud boastful character, and distinctive whiskers were a perfect match. A national manhunt then led police to the small settlement of Southern Cross, Western Australia, where, at Fraser's gold mine, a man answering the description had recently taken a job as an engineer in charge of machinery. Now going by the name Baron Swanston, his appearance and demeanour stood out like a sore thumb and left police in little doubt this was the man they were looking for. Swanston, Druin, Williams, despite his protestations of innocence, was quickly arrested from Southern Cross and transported under armed guard amid furious public demonstrations to Perth and thence to Melbourne for trial. As the news of the impending murder trial reached the shores of England, further details emerged about the victim, Emily Williams. Police in Lancashire had managed to trace her mother, Mrs. Mather, to the village of Rainhill, a few miles east of Liverpool. On recovering from the shock of the news, Mrs. Mather was able to inform them the circumstances surrounding Albert Williams' courtship and eventually marriage to her daughter. The police were particularly interested in the building work that Albert Williams, purportedly a former military man just returned from India, had carried out at Dinham Villa, the property he had rented at Rainhill. They immediately conducted a search of the house, which had remained empty since Williams and his new wife had left for Australia. And what they discovered there was beyond their worst fears. On entering, constables were soon overcome by the unmistakable stench of death. The police got to work trying to find the source of the smell. In one of the rooms, they found remains of an adult woman and two young girls buried under the fireplace. Two more children were found close by, entombed in cement beneath the floorboards. A vital piece of evidence was found buried with the victims, a book in which the name Deeming had been crossed out and replaced with Williams. At the inquest into the deaths at Rainhill, two very distressed men from Liverpool came forward to identify the deceased as the wife and children of their brother, Frederick Bailey Deeming. Marie Deeming and her three youngest children, Mary, aged 7, Sydney, 5 years old, and Leela, just 18 months old, had their throats cut, whilst the eldest girl, 10 years old Bertha, had been strangled. They had died about the same time that Albert Williams and Emily Mather had got married in September 1891. With this knowledge, and with the physical descriptions, the appearance, character, and behaviour of Albert Williams, Mr. Druin, Baron Swanston, and now Frederick Deeming, it was obvious to the police they were dealing with one very dangerous individual. With the gruesome revelations from the inquest continue to dominate the headlines, A quick-witted employee at Plymouth Priory Station, who'd apparently been following the story, noted there was a mention of certain items missing from Dinham Villa, one of which was a box. Remembering the mysterious unclaimed box which had arrived at the goods yard some 9 months earlier and gave the station of origin, he or she recognised at once there could be a significant link. Arrangements were made for the box to be sent to Lancashire, and on their arrival, the box and other items were dispatched to Widnes Police Station, where they were examined by Superintendent Niley. There was no doubting its importance as a piece of evidence, including several pieces of bedding and clothing, most of them covered in bloodstains. Also found was a coat. On the label was written FM Deeming. Perhaps damning of all, the box contained a left shoe, which made a pair with the one Marie Deeming had been wearing when she was murdered. At the conclusion of the inquest at Rainhill, Mr. S. Bryhouse, coroner for South East Lancashire, in his summing up, said the facts showed that Albert Williams, aka Mr. Druin, Barris Swanson, and Frederick Bailey Deeming were one and the same man. The inquest jury returned a verdict of willful murder against him. Meanwhile, in Australia, the trial of Deeming began in Melbourne on the 28th of April 1892, with the accused being charged in the name of Albert Oliver Williams. Despite his plea of not guilty on the grounds of insanity, and there being suggestions that he suffered from epilepsy brought on from venereal disease, not one doctor could state unequivocally that he was insane. The prison physician, Dr. Shield, said that he had examined the prisoner on numerous occasions and had not seen evidence of insanity. He also stated he could not believe a single word that Deeming said. After 4 days of evidence, the trial reached its conclusion. Deeming, ignoring the advice of his own counsel, took to the stand. He spoke for almost an hour, during which he harangued those present in the courtroom that he felt he was to blame for his predicament. He denied that he'd murdered his wife, claimed in fact she was still alive. He complained that he'd not received a fair trial, and that he'd already been judged by the general public and the press. He became abusive, criticising the prosecution evidence and calling those assembled in the court the ugliest race of people I've ever seen. And here, even as he stood trial for his very life, Deeming's boastful character could not be quelled. He began to brag of his adventures around the world and the dangers he had faced, amongst them fighting blacks on the Zambezi and wrestling with lions. At the conclusion of the trial, the jury retired to deliberate, and they took just an hour and 20 minutes to find Deeming guilty of the murder of Emily Williams. Without addressing the prisoner directly, the presiding judge passed the sentence of death by hanging. Deeming accepted his fate. He smiled and said, "Thank you." Frederick Bailey Deeming was hanged at Melbourne Jail on the 23rd of May, 1892. Casts of his head and face were made before he was buried in an unmarked grave. In the end, the evidence of the mysterious box of blood-stained clothes, which had lain in Plymouth's Friary goods yard for months, was never required. Deeming's execution in Australia meant he would never stand for trial for the murder of his wife and children. But the story didn't end there. With so many aliases and crimes, the true scale of Deeming's criminal career might never have been known. The autobiography he left in his cell may have provided some answers, but it was destroyed soon after his death, and likely the details of his life would always be open for speculation. Some have suggested that Deeming may have had a hand in some or all of the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper in autumn 1888. Others have put forward the case that he was responsible for the murder of Mary Jane Langley near Hull in July 1891. From the glut of stories about Deeming in the wake of his trial and execution, some appeared linking him to Plymouth. In early 1888, he is alleged to have been living in Devonport several weeks as Harry Lawson, one of his most commonly used aliases, with his wife, Kate, before an abrupt departure in March. Later, in 1888, a similar account has him once more residing in Devonport as Harry Lawson, this time at William Street, before an equally sudden disappearance. On the face of it, these two accounts sound similar, and it could be that these reports surfaced in 1892, witness timelines could have been confused. There is less doubt about the sighting in September 1889 when, using the alias Levi, Deeming disembarked from the British India Company steamer Jumna at Plymouth, having boarded at Aden en route from South Africa. On landing, Levi turned up at the Grand Hotel at Plymouth Hoe with his pet lion cub in tow and took a room for the night. Generous lodgings in the hotel cellars were found for the lion cub, and staff sent out to buy £5 of raw beef with which to feed it. Throughout 1890, he used various hotels around the country as a base for nationwide scams, defrauding jewellers, using false cheques. Whilst those activities between 1889 to 1891 are beyond any reasonable doubt the work of Deeming, the two unconfirmed sightings of him in Devonport in 1888 are intriguing for two very different reasons. Whilst not a commonly held theory, some researchers advance Deeming as a genuine suspect in the case of Jack the Ripper. They speculate that while living as Lawson in William Street, Devonport, during November 1888, he claimed to have received a communication requiring him to return to London urgently, which he did so alone on the next available train. In the days that followed, while Deeming was allegedly in London, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in her room at Miller's Court, Spitalfields. She had been murdered in the most savage way. A witness, George Hutchinson, came forward and gave a statement claiming he was the last to see Kelly alive, and crucially, he saw her in the company of a rather dubious-looking character. Hutchinson subsequently gave a description of the suspect that is so detailed and describes a man so flamboyantly dressed that it's been widely disregarded as a work of fiction. Nevertheless, if Hutchinson's suspect did exist, he would have shared many similarities to what was known as Deeming, and particularly his ostentatious style of dress. But if Deeming's credentials as a genuine Jack the Ripper suspect leave something to be desired, the potential sighting of Deeming at Devonport in early 1888 provides a tantalising link to a sensational Plymouth fraud case. In early 1887, Major William Walford met Edward Freeman, a Covent Garden businessman, at a pub near Clapham Junction railway station in London. From that meeting was born the idea for the Western Insurance Company Limited. Walford, the major shareholder, would act as the company secretary, and Freeman as its manager-director. Freeman's brother, John Ralph, and Plymouth-based horse dealer William Yeo were added to the board of directors, along with Plymouth shipping agent Achille Perosso, who would act as a chairman. Prospectuses were issued and shares sold, and the money started to roll in, and premiums for maritime and fire insurance cover were offered to shipholders and other businesses all over the southwest. By the end of 1887, however, some disquiet had started to be voiced about the practices of the company, primarily in Fair Play magazine, a weekly newspaper aimed at the merchant shipping industry. From within the company itself, William Yeo had started to entertain some doubts as to the character of Major Walford. These concerns were swept aside when the company proposed to buy a state-of-the-art steam fire pump for the town of Plymouth, and any worries evaporated and the council eagerly accepted the offer. At 3 o'clock on the 29th of February 1888, amid great fanfare, the Western Insurance Company presented Plymouth Town Council with a Merryweather Metropolitan steam fire pump, the town's first. A speech presentation was given by Mr. Prosy, and one of acceptance by Plymouth's mayor, Mr. Waring. Madame Prosy then christened the engine the Western, in time-honoured tradition, with a bottle of champagne. A grand banquet to honour the occasion was given in the evening, where the great and the good of the borough were regaled with more speeches and toasts, musical accompaniment provided by Her Majesty's Band of the Royal Marines, and a spectacular floral tribute presented by Hender and Sons. Gold commemorative medals, specially struck for the event, were presented by Major Walford and his wife Kate to each councillor. But it was all a scam. Within a few months, the Western Insurance Company was found to have no asset and no capital. The board members had been treating the firm's funds as their own private bank accounts and helping themselves to large sums of cash. By September 1888, the company had been formally liquidated, and every man on the board of directors faced bankruptcy and criminal charges. Perhaps the only thing of value which could be considered an asset, the fire engine gifted to the town of Plymouth by the company, was sold to reimburse creditors. It was July 1889 before the case was concluded at Devon Summer Assizes, held at Exeter Castle. William Yeo was acquitted all charges. It seems he was genuinely duped into joining the board. The chairman, Kelly Prosy, had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud and claimed he was too a victim of Walford, and he had since learned that Walford was in fact a man named Williams who'd never been a major in the army. Prosy took the biggest hit, and as well as being declared bankrupt, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Other board members received sentences up to 1 year imprisonment with hard labour. And only one man escaped judgment. Major William Walford had not been seen since the presentation of the fire engine at the end of February 1888, and all attempts to locate him went without success. In 1892, a Plymouth magistrate who'd been closely following the news of the Melbourne and Rainhill murders began to wonder whether the mysterious Major was in fact Frederick Bailey Deeming. Inquiries were made to the wife of one of the Western Insurance Company directors, although unnamed. This was clearly Madame Prosy, who, in the absence of her imprisoned husband, was now running a tobacco shop in George Street. Madame Prosy was presented with a photograph of Deeming, and she immediately identified it as Major Walford. Producing a photo of Walford of her own, the magistrate was struck by the similarities. Indeed, only the hairstyle had altered. When the same photo of Deeming was shown to staff at the Grand Hotel, they at once recognised Mr. Levi, who had memorably stayed at the hotel, accompanied by his pet lion 3 years previously. The magistrate was left in no doubt that Walford was Deeming, and the evidence of the photographs, his personal knowledge of the character, behaviour and appearance of the Major was, in his opinion, beyond dispute. The physical similarities and characteristics of both men and the identification by several people who were familiar with Walford make it possible that he was in fact Demon. The sighting and the abrupt departure of Harry and Kate Lawson from Devonport in March 1888 and Walford's real identity of Williams tie in nicely. And whilst we've barely scratched the surface of Demon's life story, it is perhaps not unlikely that a man whose activities in Plymouth vary wildly from an almost comic appearance with a lion cub at a hotel to leaving a box of bloody clothes belonging to his murder victims at a railway station should be capable of perpetrating the Western Insurance Company fraud, and almost at the very point of exposure, amid great celebratory crowds, the brazenness to present a fire engine to the town council. And with that, we leave the story of Frederick Bailey Deeming, a man of many aliases and an evil murderer. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I hope you enjoyed that one, and until next time, bye bye.